Only 5 years ago, the FBI began arresting Buddhist priests, Japanese language school teachers, and community leaders. Within 2 months of the U.S. government began the mass incarceration of all Japanese Americans from the West Coast.
I still remember being 17 when 9/11 happened. Probably the first Allied solidarity friendship event I remember attending at that young age, at such a difficult time for our country, was hosted by Japanese Americans in Southern California.
I think many of us have been thinking about the words of Pastor Martin Niemöller, who you remember from World War II.
First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist.
Then they came to take away the trade unionists.
And I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist.
Then they came to take away the Jews.
And I did not speak out because I was not a Jew.
Then they came to take away me.
And there was no one left to speak out for me.
Candidate Trump first floated the idea on Pearl Harbor Day, 2015.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
He'd support a mandatory database to track all Muslims in the U.S.
We've done it with Iran back a while ago. We did it during World War II with Japanese, which, you know, call it what you
Come
will,
on.
maybe wrong.
You're not proposing we go back to the days of internment camps, I hope.
No. I'm not proposing that at all, Megan. But what I am saying is that we need to protect America.
I mean, that's the kind of stuff that gets people scared, Carl.
Right. But I'm just saying there is precedent for it, and I'm not saying...
How dare you? That was not a precedent. It was a warning that we must never let that happen again.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
It was a national emergency. People were panicked. There were stories about submarines being off the coast, Japanese submarines.
And the Navy Secretary suggested that there were Japanese spies and saboteurs that aided the enemy attack.
I remember that Sunday morning, I'll never forget. We were working out in the field, turned on the radio, just taking a rest, and then it was interrupted with a news flash. Japan is bombing Pearl Harbor, and I remember saying, what a stupid thing Japan is doing. Who do they think they are, bombing our country?
The next morning, there was a military man in front of our house. And then after that, we were not allowed to go beyond a certain block.
This is my mom standing in line waiting to get her family number that they would wear when they were to show up to be removed from their homes. It's a remarkable photo because it captures the expression on her face, but also the posters in the back that notified people how many days they had before they were going to be removed.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a great man who did great things during the Depression to get us out of that, signed Executive Order 9066. This nation was swept up in war hysteria, racism, and the failure of political leadership.
I remember we started to gather anything that was Japanesey, like magazines, records, pictures, anything, and we start to burn them.
The media was a primary disseminator of stereotypes of not just Japanese, but Asians more broadly.
Fanatically convinced that the Japanese family was especially created for one single purpose: to crush, to conquer, and to rule like gods over all the other people of the earth.
One of the major themes prior to World War II within the media was the yellow peril. That is, Asians posing as a threat to Western civilization and Christianity.
We had been depicted in terms of stereotypes, rather unattractive stereotypes. Comic buffoons, the silent servant, the vicious villain. The soil was tilled, so to speak.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
And so, right after Pearl Harbor, they had us all register. And then shortly after the registry, they came down with a curfew.
Registration was not benign. It provided the infrastructure for the mass removal and confinement. First was the identification of you as a marked person. Second was the given number, anonymity.
And then we discovered that our bank accounts were frozen. We were financially paralyzed. And then the soldiers came to get us. And so my brother and I were gazing out the front window, and we saw two soldiers marching up our driveway. They carried rifles with shiny bayonets on them, and literally at gunpoint, we were ordered out of our home. We followed them out onto the driveway and waited for our mother to come out. And when she came out, tears were streaming down her cheeks.
Dorothea was asked to photograph the evacuation of the Japanese Americans. She had done government photography before during the Depression. She took her camera out on the streets, first in the city and then out into the fields, where she did Migrant Mother with the children and the mother who can't help them. That same sensibility she brought with her in her photography of the internment, because she was looking for the human story inside of a vast movement of people. The government wanted a record to show that this had been a humane process, that it had been done in an orderly way, and that there was nothing for anyone to complain about. Dorothea's feelings were very different. To her, it was such a suspension of civil liberties. She wanted to do this work. It's not that anybody was twisting her arm. She wanted to do this to make her own point. When Dorothea was 7, she got polio. And from that point on, she became an outsider. And that absolutely formed her life as a photographer. And it gave her a tremendous sympathy for people who were struck down by adversity. She wanted to make a record of what the lives were like for the people who were about to face this extraordinary event. Women who had just put up the last of the laundry. Beautiful family homes, making sure the family pets were in the photograph so that you saw the dog that was going to have to be left behind. A farmer the night before internment. It's so poignant. He's left everything absolutely clean. There's not
nothing's out of place, and he's got to walk away.
Those photographs are indispensable to our historic remembrance of a really important past. I think they speak volumes.
The Chinese have a saying, one picture is worth 1,000 words. And those pictures capture both the stress and the resilience.
Dorothea Lange had photographed my aunt, Kimiko Kitagaki, with all her personal belongings, getting ready to go to Tanforan and San Bruno, which was the racetrack. They weren't set up pictures. She was able to capture moments in people's lives when their lives changed forever.
The logo stands for our family. It's the Mochita family logo. And I haven't seen it on anything else, just on pieces of luggage that we had with us when we were sent to camp. The fact that my dad put that symbol on all our luggage, to me, means that the little possessions that we were able to take, that he wanted to make sure that we could get them after we were done.
We had to leave so much behind. My father sold his car for $5. It was painful. Everybody, the whole nation, our neighbors, were looking at us with suspicion and fear, and some with outright hatred.
Now the actual migration got underway. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort.
This euphemistic language distorted what they were doing to us. Evacuation rather than forced removal. Assembly centers rather than temporary prison camps.
You have a confinement with barbed wire fences and armed guards, guns pointing in, when your freedom is limited. Incarceration is much more accurate about what happened to Japanese Americans as opposed to the word internment.
Now they were taken to racetracks and fairgrounds where the Army almost overnight had built assembly centers. They lived here until new pioneer communities could be completed on federally owned lands in the interior.
The government narrative about the incarceration was that the Japanese Americans willingly went to these prisons. And what they didn't tell for many years were the other stories, the counter-narrative. In 1942, Fred Korematsu was charged with refusing the exclusion orders and hid out, changed his name, and was arrested and then taken to the horse stalls at Tanforan.
People don't realize that my dad was vilified from day one of his resistance of the military orders. When he was taken from federal jail over to the Presidio and then over to Tanforan Detention Assembly Center in San Bruno, no one wanted anything to do with him. And they thought that if they associated with my father, that some harm might come to them. Not even his brothers supported him.
He challenged his exclusion, but the Supreme Court upheld the government incarceration of Japanese Americans. And his case represented one of the worst in American jurisprudence. Uprooting 110,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry without the right to an attorney, without a hearing, without the right to a trial, and not one act of espionage or sabotage ever being proven against a Japanese American.
What happened to us didn't just suddenly happen because of Pearl Harbor. There was 40 years of anti-Japanese movement from the early 1900s to get rid of all the Japanese on the West Coast because of competition and racism. 90% of all the vegetables in California were grown by Japanese American farmers.
Their farms were parceled out and later auctioned to mainly whites.
We were assigned numbers. Our family number, I still remember, 14737. And we were loaded onto buses, and then they ushered us to our first accommodations, which it was the stables.
Each family then was assigned one horse stall. For my parents to take their 3 children and crowd into a smelly horse stall was a degrading, painful experience.
I don't think people realized the extent to which their lives were going to be upended. My mother would never have dreamed that they were going to be incarcerated for 4.5 years.
My mother, she had a portable sewing machine, brand new. That was forbidden. That was contraband because we were not to take anything that was mechanical or had sharp points or edges to it. My mother smuggled in her portable sewing machine. She marched right past those armed soldiers carrying a contraband.
I didn't know what we were doing there, and I often asked my mother, when are we going to leave? When are we going to go back to Hayward? What's happening? But she couldn't answer those questions.
We were there at Santa Anita Racetrack for a couple of months while the camps were being built. And when the construction was completed, they loaded us onto trains and transported 2/3 of the way across the country to the swamps of southeastern Arkansas.
It was extremely difficult being uprooted.
The temperatures soared from freezing to over 100 degrees.
I remember dust storms all the time.
When a dust storm would come, you couldn't breathe.
My mother, she wrote in her diary about this wind that never stopped, about the sand in her face. My mother was pregnant here, and she gave birth to my brother here. It was here that they really felt the peak of their despair. When I read her diary, it's one thing, but when I'm here, I feel a whole range of emotions. I'm actually wanting to feel this wind. Yeah, that was what they had, you know.
They call it relocation, but I call it concentration camp. We didn't have any heat in our flimsy barrack. My father caught pneumonia, and 21 days after he got there, he died in a makeshift barrack hospital.
Ansel Adams, the great nature photographer, was a friend of the director of Manzanar and was invited to come to the camp to photograph the people. I was just 3 years old at the time, and it happened to be my birthday. There are basically no cameras in Manzanar. So for me, it's a memory of kind of my beginnings. This is the only thing I have during that time period.
Ansel Adams' work is really important to talk about because when he was brought to the camp, he was determined to show Japanese residents as human beings. And he didn't make them look like the rats that they were portrayed at the time. He was highly criticized for showing the enemy as human beings.
I thought he was a huge man with these boots on, and there we were standing waiting for school to start, and he asked us to be in the picture.
People of Japanese descent were vilified, and they were shown as evil caricatures, and they all had one face. And he gave a very individual human face to each person he photographed, and he photographed almost everybody in the camp.
Nowadays, many critics excoriate the pictures because they feel like he didn't show the hardships of life.
There's a beautiful photograph he took of a mother and her daughter, and they're in very pretty clothes, and it just looks like they have the loveliest little cabin. Well, Ansel left out, they had the door that was at the end of the barrack.
Both Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange were forbidden by the government to photograph the barbed wire fence or sentry towers. Those baseball fields were right near the barbed wire fence. That's not in the photographs.
Dorothea Lange, she'd go in the location, she'd have problems with the administrator, trying to get access to photographing in the camp. She had a conflict with them because she was showing too much emotion, more than they wanted to see.
Everywhere she went, she was followed by the military police. There would be a police guy accompanying her. She would be asked over and over again to show her papers. And they would put her in a room and tell her she had to wait until she could speak to the military police and have her papers checked. And she'd sit there fuming with her camera in her lap. She wanted to get out there and photograph. The government made these photographic records for themselves. They did not intend to use them publicly. Some of them were impounded right away. Photographs that they felt looked suspicious. For example, the Japanese Americans built a lath house for starting the seeds. Dorothea photographed people working in these lath houses, but the shadows that fell from the laths made it look like they were imprisoned behind bars. And so those were impounded immediately. Dorothea's photographs actually, after the war, were put into the National Archives. They kind of were buried away, and nobody saw them for a very long time.
I think in retrospect, the government felt that it was a shame and an embarrassing experience. They did not want it documented or publicized. But where there is oppression, there is resistance. Dorothea Takei, who was a photographer, managed to make a box camera and sneak in film and take pictures. Takei took some fantastic photos given the equipment that he had. Like that iconic photo of that boy on the barbed wire, the forbidden landscape.
Cameras were not allowed, and we could not take pictures. My father was able to teach art because art school was open to everyone, and it was a diversion. My mother also did portraits and paintings. She painted knowing that they may be of historical significance sometime.
These were interesting because they were protest messages. They were messages against what was happening to them. The anger that they felt towards the government for having done this to them, which they couldn't express in public meetings, but they felt it very deeply.
The government and the Army developed what was called the loyalty questionnaire. There were a series of questions. The most prominent ones were number 27 and 28, and these questions asked if you would be willing to bear arms against the enemy.
And will you forswear any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan? And most of us didn't even know who they're talking about. And besides, we're Americans, so why would they ask us about the Emperor of Japan?
My father said they took my business, they took our home, they took our freedom. Now they want our dignity. We will not submit to that. And they both answered no.
If you answered yes, yes, you were automatically put in the loyal category, which meant then you could be drafted. You could also have clearance to leave and go back home. If you answered no, no, or if you refused to answer, or if you gave a partial answer, or if you did no yes, then you were all put in the disloyal category.
Disloyal? They weren't disloyal. They were outraged.
The government decided that all those who were considered disloyal need to be segregated to a separate prison camp.
Tule Lake was the camp where 12,000 people who protested this ill-conceived, incompetently administered loyalty questionnaire ended up being sent to Tule Lake, which became a maximum security prison.
So now they're going to treat them like hardened criminals. 3 layers of barbed wire fence, a half a dozen tanks patrolling the perimeter.
Instead of the standard 8 guard towers, there are 24 guard towers. It was harder to get coal. It was harder to have hot water. My mother writes about how difficult it was to get enough milk for the children.
They forced the internees to build a cement jailhouse, which we referred to as a stockade. They were put into that cement jailhouse, and they were interrogated. It was brutal.
The stockade imprisoned over 200 people. They were held for things like being too smart for their own good, or associates with troublemakers. There were no charges. There were no sentences. Nobody knew why they were in there.
My father was a dissident. He was opposed to how they were being treated. He was opposed to the fact that their constitutional rights were violated. So my father gives a 5-sentence speech saying that we need to ask the U.S. government to treat us equal to the free people. He was taken, put in the jail in Tule Lake, and then removed to Bismarck, North Dakota. My mother had no idea where he was going, what was going to happen to him. She says in her diary, "I wonder if today's the day they're going to line us up and shoot us."
The war never ended for Japanese who were incarcerated. Despite being released, given scanty funds for their bus ride, there was considerable anxiety, wondering about the neighbors and their reception upon coming back.
The hardest thing, I think, for me was when we came back and we're in school and we're taunted a lot by other students. You know, they called us Jap and made negative remarks about how we should have been put away.
My sister was a senior, and when announcement came for all seniors to go to the principal's office to get their capping out measurement, she was excitedly joined her classmates and went there. And when she got there, the principal took her aside and said, "We decided we don't want any Japs at our graduation, so you can attend."
Our first home was on Skid Row, downtown Los Angeles. My teacher called me the little Jap boy. It stung. And she was mean to me. Occasionally, when I felt a little confident, I would raise my hand. She would look the other way. By that time, I was getting to understand that my parents were very hurt by the internment, and so I didn't tell my parents.
The camps were closing down. People were being released, except for those that had been identified as dissidents. So my mother, this was really one of the most heart-wrenching parts of her diary. Every day she was hoping that she would be released, and every day other people's names were shown on the list and her name never came up.
In a San Francisco federal court, an echo from World War II. It's a sad chapter. The internment of Japanese Americans. At issue today is whether the U.S. government lied about why those Japanese Americans were put in camps.
For 40 years, Fred Korematsu has lived with a criminal conviction. His name attached to a landmark Supreme Court ruling that in time of war, American citizens can be imprisoned on the basis of race. In 1942, Korematsu refused to obey military orders, interning more than 100,000 Japanese Americans. The Army justified the mass imprisonment as a military necessity, citing evidence of espionage and sabotage by Japanese Americans, including signaling enemy ships from the West Coast.
The government lied to the Supreme Court. They were telling lies about the danger of Japanese Americans, both about instances of espionage and sabotage, and had altered evidence to win these cases at all costs. So fraud was committed on the Supreme Court in the original decisions of Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Yasui, which upheld the government incarceration and exclusion of Japanese Americans.
Internal documents now reveal that at the time, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover wrote, "In no case has there been illicit signaling from shore to ship."
Even J. Edgar Hoover, no fan of civil rights, said, you know, I have files on all the dangerous people. He had files on everyone, of course. And his conclusion was that we know who the dangerous ones are, and there's not very many of them, and we could take care of them.
A Justice Department attorney wrote that statements of espionage and sabotage are intentional falsehoods.
During the war, there were about 18 spies arrested. None of them were of Japanese ancestry.
The Enemy Alien Control Division said it is highly unfair to this racial minority that these lies go uncorrected.
The issue before me was whether the government had misrepresented certain facts, both to the district court and to the Supreme Court.
I had to do some real deep thinking in order to reopen this case again, and I am very happy that I did, because this is not only for just the Japanese American citizens, but it's for all American citizens.
In court, I started out saying, we are here today to seek a measure of justice denied to Fred Korematsu and the Japanese American people some 40 years ago. And Fred gave a really strong argument about how the last time he was in this court, he was in handcuffs.
So the government offered Mr. Korematsu a pardon. I heard Mr. Korematsu say a couple of times that maybe he should have offered them a pardon because they were the ones that needed to be forgiven.
My father never considered for 1 minute to accept a pardon from the government. He was so deep-rooted in his beliefs that the government was wrong that he would never, ever accept a pardon on any condition, because a pardon means that you are guilty, and he was never guilty.
There was a crowd of about 1,000 people, many of whom were people who were incarcerated. We could hear them quietly crying during the hearings. The court ruled that there was no military justification for the incarceration of Japanese Americans.
The courtroom just erupted. And people came up to my father and, hugged him and congratulated him, and they were all in tears. This weight went off his shoulders, lifted off his shoulders.
This kind of thing should not happen, and it should serve as a warning to all of us.
Even though Judge Patel overturned my father's conviction, Korematsu versus United States is still on the Supreme Court record. It's been discredited, but the Supreme Court can only reverse itself. And as of today, it has not done so.
I was too young to understand, but I do remember the barbed wire fence from which my parents warned me to stay away. I remember the sight of high guard towers. I remember soldiers carrying rifles. And I remember being afraid.
There was two parts to this. One was the reparations of $20,000 for all surviving members, and then there was the presidential apology.
We gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race.
So my mother got her check, and I said, I want to see it before you cash it. Okay, where's the check? She said, it's over there. And somewhere on the wall was framed already the presidential apology. And somewhere in that pile was the 20 grand. And I said, Mom, what's it mean to you? And she said, I feel like I finally got my face back.
Dorothea Lange always said that she did a very bad job of her incarceration photographs. I think it was because it was such a very difficult and sad experience in her life that she just associates her work as not being up to her standards. But it was very obvious from just looking at the pictures that she did a great job.
Dorothea said, on the surface, it looked like a narrow job. Actually, it wasn't narrow at all. The deeper I got into it, the bigger it became. I never had a comfortable feeling about that war relocation job. Because the challenges were so difficult in the job, the way she was really being stepped on by the government and controlled in what she could do, it just chafed for her. She hated being restricted, and those kind of restrictions meant she couldn't get the photograph she really wanted.
Those are like the iconic images of the internment. If we didn't have these photographs, this story would be it's a blip in U.S. history.
You know, people look back and they say, well, these things can't happen again, but I don't believe that. I see, you know, the hysteria over Muslim people of Muslim faith being almost the same level.
The Japanese American community, who can speak from personal experience, many of them survivors themselves of the internment camps right here in the United States, humanizes the worst case scenario. We don't have to convince Japanese Americans that national security policy unchecked can tear apart our country's Bill of Rights.
This was done to us in America. And you would think at the time it was just so horrifying. And when I think of my mom and dad and the sacrifices they had to make and the people that lost all their businesses, and yet we're on the verge of doing it again.
It's the same kind of sweeping, generalized condemnation, characterization of a group of people. We're Americans, but we look like the people that bombed Pearl Harbor, so we got categorized as such.
I turned on the television and I watched in horror as so many different things that I loved and believed in were attacked. And I saw my community come under attack. People having to line up outside of immigration buildings for special registration, mosques being targeted. All things that hadn't really occurred to me growing up in the United States.
The day after September 11th, the Japanese American organizations called many of the Muslim groups around the country. And you said, we want to offer your support. We've been through this.
Camps don't happen overnight. Mass arrests don't happen overnight. They're a process. They begin with the fomenting of hate. They're followed by government policy that collects more information than they need to. And then it's slow targeting. First, we have to find where the Muslims are. Then we have to get them registered. Then we send FBI informants into their mosques. Then we come for them.
We are standing in solidarity with the Muslim community.
Actor and activist George Takei unveils a petition signed by more than 300,000 Americans opposing any sort of Muslim ban by President Trump.
We are going to be relentless in raising the awareness on the part of Americans.
National security was used when Pearl Harbor was bombed to incarcerate us, and national security is being brought up again. They're using this false fear of national security being in jeopardy.
Harassed, we need to stand up. We need to call people out. We need to question the hateful speech that we may be hearing. I know that it can go against your natural instinct to be assertive, to be proactive in your day-to-day, but we need to have each other's backs because we are always stronger in numbers.
For a baby and a wedding are the only registries I support. And if a Muslim one ever comes to fruition, sign me up. Will you be signing? I said, will you be signing? Because this is survival.
We got to make sure that we defend our Constitution, that we defend our brothers and sisters who are in harm's way. We have to make sure that we defend our own humanity, because that's really what's at stake in this country.
And we will stand by you to ensure that our country's history does not repeat itself. Know that I am so grateful for all of you. Thank you.